A stray dog stumbles upon an abandoned baby in the trash and instinctively carries it towards safety. The doctor is stunned by the sight. The Brooklyn streets lay shrouded in fog, tendrils of mist curling around streetlights and casting shimmering reflections in scattered puddles. Amid this eerie stillness moved Shadow, an aging stray with a once brilliant copper coat now dulled and streaked with gray. His gait was slow, each step marked by a limp, the toll of years spent surviving the unforgiving city. Yet in his weary eyes, a flicker of determination remained. To the townsfolk, Shadow was a familiar presence, an unspoken guardian of the streets, earning scraps and occasional pats from shopkeepers and children alike. But tonight, an unusual tension lingered in the air. His ears twitched at a distant muffled cry carried by the wind from deep within an alley. His fur bristled, and he froze, one paw suspended mid-step, listening. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. An unfamiliar, helpless wail. Shadow took a cautious step forward, his worn nose quivering as he tracked the scent toward the dimly lit corridor ahead. The cries led him to a trash can nestled between two overflowing dumpsters. Shadow circled it, sniffing and whimpering softly. His paw nudged the lid, and another feeble cry escaped from within. He pawed at the container until, with a metallic groan, the lid tipped over. Inside lay a small bundle of cloth, barely stirring. Shadow's heart pounded as he pressed his nose closer, nudging the fabric aside to reveal a tiny, pale face. The baby's lips trembled, the only sign of life in her frail body. Urgency surged through Shadow. With delicate care, he nudged his way beneath the fabric, grasping it gently in his teeth. He carried the fragile bundle through the deserted streets, each step labored but determined. His journey led him to the outskirts of town, where a warm glow flickered from the windows of a cozy cottage. Inside, a woman named Grace was adjusting her glasses when a soft scratch at the door caught her attention. Expecting to see Shadow, seeking food, she peered out and gasped at the sight before her. "Shadow?" she whispered, stepping outside, her pulse quickening. She knelt, eyes widening at the bundle in his mouth. "What have you brought me?" Shadow set the bundle down, his brown eyes locking onto hers with silent urgency. Grace's hands trembled as she pulled back the fabric, revealing the baby's frail form. Her breath hitched. "Oh, my dear Lord," she murmured, fingers pressing against the child's cool skin. Without hesitation, she wrapped the baby tightly and whispered, "We need to get you to a hospital. Now!" Clutching the child close, Grace hurried to her car, glancing down at Shadow, who shivered from exhaustion. "You brave old soul," she whispered, mist forming in her eyes. The engine roared to life, replacing the night's stillness with urgency. The fluorescent hum of Brooklyn General's emergency room greeted them as Grace pushed through the doors, her voice unwavering but desperate. "Please, someone! This baby needs help!" A nurse looked up, startled. Seeing the frail bundle and the worry in Grace's eyes, she immediately sprang into action. "We need a doctor!" the nurse called, summoning an orderly who rushed forward with a wheelchair. Grace sank into it, still clutching the baby. She whispered softly, "It's all right, sweetheart. You're going to be all right." As she waited, she murmured, "I'll call you Victoria." The baby stirred faintly, her breath still shallow. A hush fell over the staff as whispers spread. A stray dog had carried this child to safety. "Dr. Morgan is on his way," the nurse assured, leading Grace into an examination room. "He's one of our best." Moments later, a tall, slender man entered, his weary eyes betraying long hours but his presence exuding calm. He approached with measured steps. "Good evening," he said, his voice quiet but steady. Gently, he reached for the baby. "I hear there's been an extraordinary rescue tonight." Grace met his gaze and nodded. "A dog found her in the trash and brought her to me." Her voice wavered with disbelief. Dr. Morgan's expression softened, but only briefly. As he examined the child, his fingers gently pressing against her tiny chest, his brows knitted together. "This baby has a congenital heart defect," he murmured gravely. "It's serious." A heavy silence settled over the room. Grace's breath caught. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is she going to be okay?" Dr. Morgan's jaw tightened. "There's a surgery that could save her, but it's risky. I once lost a patient to the same condition." His voice faltered. The weight of past failures hung heavy between them. He exhaled slowly. "It's not a decision I take lightly." Grace reached out, placing a hand over his. "Dr. Morgan, this child, Victoria, she deserves every chance. A stray dog of all creatures saved her life. Doesn't that mean something?" He looked down at the baby, something shifting in his expression. The miracle of her survival tugged at him. After a long pause, he let out a slow breath. "Maybe it does," he murmured, gazing at Victoria as if truly seeing her for the first time. The weight of his past met the fragile hope of the present in the quiet hum of the preparation room. Dr. Morgan stood silently, his gloved hands poised before him as he gazed at Victoria's small, delicate figure. He drew in a deep, steadying breath, the familiar weight of dread pressing on his chest. The memory of another child whose heartbeat had stopped beneath his care years ago surfaced unbidden, casting a shadow over the moment. But tonight, something felt different. The image of Shadow, steadfast and silent at Grace's side, filled his mind. There was something about that dog's determination, the fierce loyalty he showed this child, that left Dr. Morgan feeling both humbled and emboldened. He realized then, with a small, rueful smile, that if a stray dog could brave such odds, maybe he could too. A nurse beside him noticed his hesitation. She touched his arm. "Are you all right, Dr. Morgan?" He nodded, the weight of his past lifting just enough to allow him a breath of clarity. "Yes," he replied, "steady now. I'm ready. Let's give this little one her second chance." Beside him, Nurse Patel gave him a reassuring nod, her gaze steady and calm. Dr. Morgan nodded back, taking one last grounding breath as he looked down at Victoria's tiny, fragile form on the operating table. "All right," he murmured, his voice low yet resolute. "Let's begin." Years of experience kicked in, guiding his movements with precision. Yet beneath his focus, there was an edge, a fear he'd fought to suppress. This surgery was one he'd performed countless times, and yet it felt impossibly high stakes, like a fragile bridge connecting him to a place he'd closed off long ago. One wrong move could unravel everything. "Stay calm, doctor," murmured Nurse Patel, noticing his hesitation. Her soothing tone anchored him, and he gave a slight nod, allowing her calming presence to relieve the tension in his chest. But a sudden complication arose. The baby's heartbeat faltered, the monitor's steady beep spiraling into an urgent alarm. Dr. Morgan's heartbeat raced as he worked to pinpoint the problem, his grip on the instruments growing tighter. Memories of that fateful night flooded his mind. The child he couldn't save. The failure that had shadowed him ever since. "Stay focused, Dr. Morgan." Nurse Patel's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. "Steady, yet resolute. You can do this. She's counting on you." With a deep, steadying breath, he refocused, his hands finding their rhythm. He worked meticulously, his fingers swift and precise, coaxing Victoria's heartbeat back to a steady rhythm. Gradually, the alarm silenced, the room settling into a tense, reverent hush. Outside, Grace sensed the shift, glancing at Shadow, whose eyes still watched the door with unflinching loyalty. "She's going to be okay," she murmured, as though convincing herself, her hand resting against Shadow's back. After what felt like hours, the doors finally swung open. Dr. Morgan emerged, his face weary but filled with quiet relief. He met Grace's gaze, the burden of his past seeming to lift in that single shared look. "She's going to be fine," he said, his voice soft, almost awed. Victoria's going to be okay. Grace let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, tears welling in her eyes as she bent down to embrace Shadow. "Thank you," she whispered. Her words meant for both Shadow and Dr. Morgan. She felt a wave of gratitude for the second chances life had granted to all of them. Shadow, Victoria, and even Dr. Morgan, who had finally emerged from his own darkness. The days after Victoria's surgery unfolded in a blur of cautious hope for Grace. Each morning began with her arriving early at the hospital to sit by Victoria's bedside. She would hold the baby's tiny hand and speak softly to her, painting pictures of the world outside and the bright future waiting for her. Shadow often curled up beneath her chair, his quiet presence providing her with a deep sense of comfort. As the child grew stronger, Grace's heart swelled with a deep protective love she hadn't felt in years. Sitting with Victoria one quiet morning, Grace found herself whispering words she hadn't dared before. "I don't know where you came from, Victoria, but I feel like you were meant to be here with me." She brushed a gentle hand across the baby's cheek, her voice soft with wonder. Maybe I could give you a home, sweetheart. Would you like that?" Even as Grace spoke, she sensed that events were unfolding beyond her view. The police, deeply touched by Victoria's story, had been driven to act. Their hearts moved by the miraculous rescue. They combed through records with unwavering resolve, piecing together scattered clues. Then, one evening, Grace received a call from an officer with an update. "We've located her mother," he said softly, his voice measured and careful. "She's been through a lot and, well, she's very eager to reunite with Victoria." That night, Grace sat in her kitchen, her heart heavy. She felt both relieved and afraid, torn between her desire to protect Victoria and the knowledge that the little girl had a mother who loved her, however lost she might have been. Shadow sat beside her, his warm, comforting presence grounding her. The following day, Grace was waiting at the hospital when Victoria's mother arrived. Jessica looked fragile, her face pale and lined with worry, her clothes hanging loose. Her hands fidgeted, and her eyes were red-rimmed as she approached the room where her daughter lay. Grace saw the conflict in her expression, the mix of longing and guilt that seemed to weigh on her shoulders. When Jessica's eyes fell on Victoria, a sob escaped her. She moved slowly, reverently, as though afraid the child would vanish. "My baby," she whispered, reaching out, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry." Grace placed a gentle hand on Jessica's shoulder, her voice filled with quiet compassion. "I know it must have been hard, Jessica, but she's here now, safe and strong, and she'll need you." She paused, her own voice softening with love. "But if you'd like, I could be here too, to help, whenever you need." Jessica looked up, her face filled with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you. I never thought I deserved a second chance." Grace smiled, her heart both aching and full. "We all need second chances, Jessica and Victoria. She deserves a family who loves her, as many people as possible." Together, they gazed at the small, resilient child whose life had united, strangers in a connection that would change them forever. For Grace, it was a bittersweet farewell to the future she had once envisioned. Yet, it also marked the beginning of something new, a family coming back together, and a role she could still have in Victoria's life. Shadow stood nearby, his calm eyes holding a quiet wisdom, as if he somehow understood he had been part of something far greater than he could ever comprehend. The afternoon light filtered through the hospital windows, casting a warm glow across Dr. Morgan's office. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the city skyline. For the first time in years, he felt at peace, a quiet acceptance of the past, and a hope he had barely dared to imagine. He had carried the weight of loss for so long, convinced it was his burden alone. But Victoria's miraculous journey had changed him. Her tiny, fragile heart had somehow mended the fractures in his own, stitching together the pieces he had thought were lost forever. As he packed his belongings to leave, a soft knock echoed at his door. Grace entered, a gentle smile on her face, Shadow at her side, his tail softly thumping against the doorframe. "Leaving so soon, Doctor?" Grace asked with a knowing look. He chuckled, warmth filling his chest in a way it hadn't in a long time. "I thought I'd take a walk, maybe visit Victoria before I go. She seems to have brought a few of us back to life, hasn't she?" Grace nodded, glancing down at Shadow, who looked up with his loyal, wise eyes. "She certainly has. And this guy, too." She scratched behind Shadow's ears. "Funny, I never thought I'd find myself caring so deeply again, for a child or a dog. But here we are." Morgan reached down, running a hand over Shadow's head. "He's quite the hero. The world could use more Shadows," he said softly, admiration in his voice. Then, after a pause, he added, "And more Graces." His tone was sincere. A week later, Grace, Jessica, and little Victoria gathered at Grace's house. It had become a routine now. Visits, dinners, and quiet moments where they simply enjoyed each other's company. Jessica had settled into a gentler, more forgiving place within herself, finding in Grace a support she had never known. Grace cradled Victoria, who gurgled happily, her tiny hands reaching for Shadow, who lay close by. Jessica sat beside them, her gaze tender, still marveling at the strength and forgiveness life had shown her. Through her daughter, through these newfound friends. "I want her to know about all of this one day," Jessica said softly, glancing at Grace. "How a stray dog, a nurse, and a kind doctor saved her life." Grace smiled, pressing a kiss to Victoria's forehead. "She will, and she'll know she's loved." Shadow, sensing the peace around him, laid his head down, his body settling comfortably on the worn rug. For the first time, he felt he had a place, a family to protect, and a life that no longer required him to roam alone. Years later, on a crisp autumn day, a young girl with bright eyes and a spirited laugh walked down the street, hand in hand with her mother. Victoria had grown into a lively, curious child, her life forever shaped by the story she had come to cherish. As they neared the small park where Shadow's story was honored with a modest plaque, Victoria knelt down to touch the engraved words. "In honor of Shadow, the stray who showed us that courage and kindness know no bounds." Beside her, Grace and Dr. Morgan stood, their bond as strong as ever. They were family in every sense, one woven together not by blood, but by love and compassion. Victoria looked up at them, her eyes wide with wonder. "I'm so lucky to have such a brave hero, aren't I?" she asked softly. "Yes, darling," Grace Ars replied, her voice filled with pride and affection. "Shadow brought us together, and his courage will always be a part of you." Victoria smiled brightly, surrounded by love, feeling as though a piece of Shadow's brave spirit would always stay with her wherever she went. Did you enjoy this story? What would you have done in Grace's shoes? Would you have given Jessica a second chance? Let us know in the comments below. If you liked the story, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and leave a like. It's truly amazing how a dog can change our lives. Thank you for listening and see you in the next video. Have a wonderful day.